Everyone knows at this point how notorious UFC fights are for their brutal injuries. When fighters are in that cage, they have to give it their all, but so many times giving it their all comes at the risk of sustaining some really gruesome blows. In today's video, we'll go over some of the most brutal injuries we've seen in UFC history. Let's start. First up, we've got Mark Hominick at UFC 129. When Mark Hominick took to the octagon in 2021 at UFC 19, he just knew he wasn't going to have an easy time up against the Brazilian mixed martial artist, Jose Aldo. The thing is that when you're in the ring with an opponent who is as skilled as Aldo, you should never let your guard down. The moment it slips, your opponent will take advantage of it, and well, it's pretty hard to recover from once that happens. Same happened with Hominick in his fight against Aldo. In the middle of the fight, Hominick let his guard down for one small moment, but because Aldo's such a professional player, he grabbed that opportunity and proceeded to launch punch after punch in poor Hominick's face. The result? Hominick's face became swollen like a balloon, and a hematoma started forming in his left eye. And the worst part is that this swelling was so big it completely changed the appearance of Hominick's face. With such a big, swollen lump on his face, it was no surprise that commentator Joe Rogan started calling it Hominick's second head. But the most surprising thing to happen that night was how Mark was allowed to continue with the fight despite the extreme extent of his severe injuries. Now let's talk about Joanna Jedrzejczyk's hematoma at UFC 248. Speaking of hematomas, how could we forget the one Joanna Jedrzejczyk sustained in her fight against Weili Zhang at UFC 248? Both Zhang and Jedrzejczyk gave each other quite a tough time as they fought for the strawweight title in that cage. Even though Zhang ended up winning, it happened to be one of the UFC's most memorable battles to date. But that's not all of it. Joanna ended up suffering a serious injury in that fight. News outlets were quick to share before and after pictures of Joanna's face. It was hard to recognize her face with the hematoma swelling up all over it. Zhang landed a punch on Joanna's face that made the latter sustain quite a brutal hematoma over her right eye. It swelled up within minutes and gave her a pretty alien-like look. Later in an interview, Joanna would go on to describe how she was really mad at herself for getting that injury. She talked about how she knew she looked like a zombie, but the hematoma would heal. The fighter was more mad at herself for getting an injury in the first place because it would get in the way of her having a nice time in Vegas with her friends and family. Well, that hematoma definitely came at the wrong time. But it all turned out okay as Joanna flew to Poland to have plastic surgery to fix the hematoma. And then Alistair Overeem's gruesome injury in 2019. Our Demolition Man suffered a big uppercut injury back in 2019 through the hands of Jairzinho Rozenstruik. Even though Alistair had the upper hand throughout most of the fight, in the final few seconds, he was sent flying over the canvas of the ring by an apparently very vicious Rozenstruik. Alistair's opponent struck him with a Hail Mary overhand, and he was on the floor within seconds. And that's not the only tough moment the Demolition Man had to go through that eventful night. That big hit ended up splitting Alistair's upper lip into two unequal halves. But the big man didn't take this injury to heart because a couple hours later, his photos of smiling wide with his lips split into two were going viral all over the internet. That's one brave man in our eyes. We can't even imagine going through something like that and then finding it in ourselves to literally smile through that much pain. Well, how about Anderson Silva's broken leg at UFC 168? If there's a UFC injury that's unforgettable, it's going to be the broken leg injury Anderson Silva sustained at the hands of Chris Wiedman during their rematch at UFC 168. Silva's regarded as one of the greatest fighters of all time, but this rematch against Wiedman was probably UFC's most painful fights in history. The 38-year-old fighter threw a left leg kick against his opponent a little too early during the second round. Wiedman, who had just won the UFC middleweight title 5 months earlier, checked Silva's left leg kick so perfectly. In fact, it was so perfect, it broke Silva's leg bones. The fight was immediately called off and Silva was tended to by the on-cage physician. Unfortunately, the injury was so severe that Silva was rushed to the University Medical Center in Las Vegas, where he underwent surgery to repair his fractured tibia and fibula. So, did we forget about Joe Jonas at UFC 159? At UFC 159, Joe Jonas was the young, seasoned fighter who would be going up against the well-respected Chael Sonnen. Both of them had some history together, seeing how they had been coaches for rival teams in the Ultimate Fighter Season 17. Well, even though Jonas won the fight, it was at the cost of a broken toe. And we're warning you not to go look at pictures of his brutal injury because they're extremely graphic. Proceed at your own risk. Joe won the fight via a technical knockout, but it was all done in a lot of pain. The fighter had to continue the rest of the match with his dislocated toe, and it was clear as day that he was having a pretty difficult time finding his footing in the cage that night. But that's the true spirit of a mixed martial artist. They go on even if the odds are not in their favor. In an interview right after the fight, Joe admitted to commentator Joe Rogan that due to the initial adrenaline rush from the fight, he hadn't even noticed the broken toe. He registered the pain quite a while later. The young fighter talked about how he had an entire trip planned to Jamaica after the tournament, but after that gruesome injury, he had to cancel his plans. And then there's also Corey Hill's snapped tibia and fibula at UFC Fight Night 16. Anderson Silva isn't the only fighter to have broken his tibia and fibula in a UFC fight. We've also got Corey Hill, who suffered through a broken tibia and fibula at UFC Fight Night 16. Up against Dale Hart in 2008, Hill made an attempt at a leg kick against his opponent, but Hart was swift to block and ended up winning the match as Hill crumpled to the ground in agony. Hill was seen holding his leg while he was in extremely deep pain. Immediately after Hill sustained this brutal injury, the fight was called off. Audiences could clearly see Hill's leg bent at a horrific angle. The surprising thing to note here is that the referee wasn't the one to notice Hill's gruesome injury. It was commentator Joe Rogan who shouted at the referee to stop the fight. Dale Hart won through a TKO. Next up, we have Belal Muhammad's eye injury at UFC Vegas 21. In UFC sites, it's a pretty common thing for fighters to give each other eye pokes in the octagon, but never have any of those eye pokes been serious enough to call off a fight. While exceptions exist, and in this case, we've got Belal Muhammad's eye injury at UFC Vegas 21. Muhammad was up against British player Leon Edwards, and it was quite a fight between these two men until it had to be called off. Edwards ended up poking Muhammad in the eye, and it wasn't any small poke either. It was pretty nasty, as you can see in the videos from that night. Muhammad's eyes started bleeding almost immediately, and the situation was so dire that the doctors strictly said the fight could not go on. Muhammad was taken to a hospital right after, where he received stitches on his eye for the injury. The fight was declared a no decision. Finally, Chris Wiedman's leg break at UFC 261. And no one can ever forget the nasty leg break Chris Wiedman suffered in a game against Uriah Hill at UFC 261. These leg breaks have been pretty brutal and pretty common in UFC history, huh? One could even say karma came for this fighter because back in 2013, Anderson Silva suffered a very similar leg break at the hands of Chris. His leg injury had been so severe that he couldn't return to training for a total 180 days. And even then, he had to get clearance from his doctors. Good thing is, Wiedman's surgery was a success even though he received plenty of stitches. As can be seen in a photo he uploaded on his Instagram, most of his fans thought it better for Wiedman to quit fighting and focus on his recovery. That's a wrap for this video. Want to hear more about the most gruesome injuries in UFC history? Let us know in the comments below. Make sure to give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel for more videos like this. See you in the next one.